Okay, thank you for talking to us today about your article, which is devoted to the embargo cake. Maybe you can tell us what recipe the cake is made of.
Thank you, Florian, very much for inviting me for giving me the opportunity to talk about this paper. Well, the recipe is not there. I didn't really include the recipe, though there are some hints within the article about the ingredients that went to the recipe. However, it's very simple. There are just very few simple ingredients consisting of basically whatever people had in their household, mainly revolving around some flour, sugar, and some oil, and maybe a bit of fruit. So that's the whole idea. However, the embargo cake that I used in the title stands as a metaphor for the whole sort of new wave of recipes and ways of procuring basic foodstuffs during the economic crisis in the 1990s in Serbia. It was a period of hardship, of economic hardship, and at the same time the war was going on in the neighboring countries of former Yugoslavia. So there was a lot of turmoil going on in the country, with a lot of displaced people coming to Serbia. At the same time, there was a big emigration outpour of the sort of young and educated people leaving the country. And this research started in a way quite a few years ago, in 2005. And at the time, I was doing a research about the emigration from Serbia, and people kept coming back to the hyperinflation and the embargo as the big push factors for people to leave the country in the 1990s, which is what drew my attention to those years. So in a way, in people's narratives, the embargo stood out, and the embargo cake stood out as the big metaphor for whatever was going on during those years. And it was something that I believe deserved academic attention to be sort of unpacked, and to see what people still remembered, which strategies people used to circumvent the crisis in the 1990s. Because, to put it in plain words, shops were empty, people still needed to eat something. So how did they get by of food? Where did they find food? So that was my main idea. I wanted to look into that. And because this year marked 2 decades since the end of that eponymous hyperinflation in Serbia, I also used it an opportunity to wrap this project up and to say, okay, it's been 20 years now. Let's see what is the legacy of that period, which of the effects are still around, and which have sort of dissipated with the normalization of the economic situation in Serbia.
When you also refer to specifically World War II or post-World War II shortages, which people refer to, they relate the hyperinflation and sanctions period to these earlier periods. So how is that link established? Is it personal? Is it memory? Is it a certain way saying we're suffering as much as people did in World War II, or how are those two periods connected?
The two periods are connected in a way. It's one of the biggest, one of the main sort of how to put it, not the main, but one of the strategies that people used to circumvent the crisis of the 1990s was by going back to the past. And when I say to the past, it means by going back to the sort of a pre-industrial way of life, looking at how the previous generation coped with previous periods of crisis, such was the one during the Second World War and the period immediately after the Second World War. So it was a step back to the ways of procuring food, for the ways of growing one's own food, for preparing the food according to the recipes from that period of time. So in a way, it was the sort of re-traditionalization, but at the same time, it wasn't the sort of re-traditionalization that we know of in social sciences, which was criticized widely in the 1990s and in recent years by social scientists as something that sort of brought on very negative effects. However, in this case, this return back to traditional ways and forms of life, traditional ways of producing food and getting hold of food was a way of circumventing the crisis. So it was basically thanks to the knowledge that was preserved in personal memories and in intergenerational transmission of knowledge between one generation and the next one that people have managed to survive that period of hardship.
What kind of, I mean, because you're talking also about the social networks and ties people develop as a result of these shortages, right? To overcome them. So how do you understand these ties which emerged? I mean, are they in a certain way denser social ties which became about because exactly the kind of, let's say, modern anonymous procurement of foodstuffs and so on basically collapsed?
Yes, social networks came into, they were present even before the crisis. We have to be aware of that. However, they become much denser during the economic crisis because they substituted for the either collapsed or insufficiently effective social institutions. So it wasn't people did not refer and go back to their social networks for procuring food, but they also went to their social networks to seek help in terms of employment, in terms of housing, for medical services. Social networks were a substitute for the institutions that were not in place or that were not working as effectively as was needed at the time. And that is one of the biggest, I would say, one of the biggest effects of the crisis of the 1990s was the prominence of those social networks, because they're still very much in place. At least this is what my research participants all claim to be the case. And people still rely a lot on social networks, not in terms of, obviously, in terms of procuring basic foodstuffs, because that is widely available nowadays. However, for employment, for social security, such as housing, for financial support, social networks will probably be the first port of call rather than institutions in the country. So this is something that is that I found really interesting as the, I would say, longest lasting legacy of the crisis of the 1990s in Serbia.
But I mean, could you also argue that this is an enduring coping strategy? I mean, if you're saying it's a legacy and you kind of use nearly negative ways to describe it, saying that people don't look at institutions but at these social networks. But if institutions continue to fail for different reasons, now they can provide foodstuffs, but as you point out, I mean, employment is another issue and other ones. So is that not just a viable network which provides people with access to services and goods they don't have access otherwise?
That is true, but at the same time, it also means that those who are outside those social networks have no source of help. So you have to be part of a network, and it means that you also have to be able to offer something to that network. Mm-hmm. And people who fall out of those networks are usually either those who are out of employment, so retired people, people who cannot work for medical reasons. So you have to, in order to receive help, you have to be able to offer some sort of help as being part of a social network.
Which groups of people do you see from your interviews you've done as being particularly able to access these networks? Is it just the ability to offer something, or is it other profiles? I mean, in terms of education, in terms of gender, in terms of age, or so, where you find that they are more able to access these networks than others?
Obviously, people with higher social and cultural capital will be those that are more favorable and who are more able to use the social networks, because they bring in more skills, more contacts, more people that they know. So it will be mostly younger people, working people, that sort of age, maybe between 20 and 50 years of age. And I would say that both men and women take part. However, I would say that women sort of still maybe use more their family networks within their social networks rather than maybe their colleagues or their work contacts compared to men.